I worked in a factory on the lathe machines, making bits and pieces. We were told we had to make 800 pieces a day. 800. The army set up 2 6-inch cannons on the seafront and reels of barbed wire, anything to prevent the Germans from invading.
The headlines in every newspaper were, "Germany has surrendered. We had won the war."
The great news ran through the land. Manchester, Glasgow, Cardiff, Birmingham, London. In every town and village, big and small.
I was out with my friends, talking and playing games, when suddenly I saw what I thought was my brother approaching. He was carrying his bag and had a cap on. As he approached, I felt it had to be my brother. So I ran home and exclaimed to my parents and sisters, "I think Murray has come home." We all went outside and saw him in the distance. My mother couldn't run, but my 2 sisters ran up to him. I was only a small boy, but I was so happy to see my brother. We cried and kissed him. We hadn't seen him for over 6 years.
One day, my headmaster was standing on the balcony with tables on either side and at the front, which were laid with presents. Our parents were stood all around. The headmaster began giving a speech on each child, one after another. Suddenly, 4 to 6 stormtroopers marched up to him, beat him, and dragged him out. We all didn't know what was happening. They had to stop the ceremony. Even though it wasn't finished, we had to leave.
I was given a letter to take home to my mother. The school I went to was a day school. I usually went back and forth by myself. When I got home, I passed the letter to my mother. She opened it, read it, and it made her extremely angry. The next day, she came with me to school to talk to the teacher. There was a woman there with a white coat. She was a Nazi doctor. I didn't know what was going on. All the boys were made to take off their clothes. At that time, I had no idea why we had to. Only that my mother was very angry. I was forced to leave the school because they had discovered I was Jewish.
There was a group of the Nazi youth coming towards us. They asked, "Are you a Jew?" And if you said yes, they would beat you up. I looked up at my brother, who told me to make a cross sign on my chest. I didn't know why. They asked me if I was Jewish. I nodded, but I carried on making the cross sign. I was very confused. The cross relates to the crucifix that you would wear on a necklace, but I didn't know that then. I was only a little girl, and I hadn't seen any religious jewellery. They asked me, "Are you sure you're not a Jew?" I hesitated, but in the end they let me go. A teacher came out and hurried us away. If I hadn't have convinced them, I would have been beaten.
I went to the British Embassy, asking for advice. about what was happening in England. They asked me if I was British, and I answered yes. They said, "You must go home now, and go as quick as you can." I was in a state of panic. I rushed back and packed my bags and caught the last boat. I arrived in Harwich safely, but I found things were very strange. There was a different atmosphere. I caught the train to Liverpool Street Station, and when I stepped off the train, I was so shocked to see all the lamps dimmed and soldiers walking around with gas masks. It was dark and there was panic. The tube was in blackout too. When I eventually arrived home, I pressed the doorbell and my father and mother opened the door and said, "David!" And I was given a smack. A good old smack, in fact. He said, "I sent telegram after telegram after telegram, but received no reply. You're naughty for ignoring them." I said, "Don't worry, I'm here and I'm okay." But the very next day, war had broken out.
All the family was deaf, and there weren't any deaf clubs nearby, so everyone used to come over to my mother's house. I used to look forward to that, seeing all the adults signing to each other. My mother would make tea for everyone outside, and all the hearing people were amazed to see all these deaf people, so full of life, chatting away into the evening. They never seemed to want to go home. I loved it. When it was time for me to go back to boarding school, I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay at home. The door was always open. There were never any worries about leaving it open. The key was just inside the letterbox, and all the family knew where it was, but we'd just leave it open. There were never any worries or fear about anyone coming in. One deaf man came up with the idea of rigging up the doorbell so that when it rang, a tennis ball would drop down on a piece of string and it would swing, letting you know there was somebody at the door.
Throng surged round Buckingham Palace at night and cheered madly when the King and Queen appeared on a balcony to acknowledge the joyous greeting.
Oh, it was beautiful. There was a parade all the way to St. Paul's Cathedral. The king was very brave. He really wasn't well at the time, but looked very regal. His wife, too, was majestic. After the service, we left the church. Then we had our own party to celebrate the Silver Jubilee at Oak Lodge School. Then, in 1936, suddenly King George died in January. Everyone was so upset, because he hadn't lived long. The teacher asked us if we'd like to go and see King George lying in state. We were all keen, though only the top class was asked. The teacher warned us that there would be a long queue, but we still said we wanted to go. Luckily, it wasn't snowing or raining, because we were indeed queuing for hours. Our teacher told us not to laugh. We had to look sad, which of course we did. In the Westminster Hall, the King's body was surrounded by 4 honour guards. It was very moving as we made our way right round the hall to the exit.
It was awful, really.
I lived in Berlin, you see, so I saw a lot of German soldiers. My parents were divorced, so my mother looked after the three of us, my two brothers and myself. She would often tell me not to go to the park, or that if I did go, to never sit on the red benches, never. But I always had to sit over on the yellow seats, which were for Jews. One day, my deaf brother and I decided to ignore the rule, and we ran to sit on the red bench. No, we ran to sit on the yellow bench. Oh. Well, when we got home, my mother went spare and really smacked us. I didn't understand what I'd done to deserve being smacked, because my mother didn't explain it to us. Well, she didn't know how to because we were deaf. I started school in 1936, and after a few months there were suddenly Olympic flags and decorations all over. It was really beautiful. There were flags on top of the poles, and the children had England emblems on their breast pockets. I don't remember if it was the St. George's Cross, but it did say England. The children would all play games, pretending they were taking part, and awarded prizes of food to the winners. It was really lovely.
There was a rumour going around everywhere that he had a woman called Wallis Simpson. Scandalous. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, gave him a choice. Either he was to abdicate or give up Wallis Simpson if he wanted to keep his throne. We wanted Edward to be king, but we certainly didn't want that woman. If Edward were king, then she would be queen. A twice divorced woman. That was no good.
It was the day before Easter Day in 1938. It was a special day for us. The children painted hard-boiled eggs in colourful designs. We were really excited when the teacher put chocolate eggs, and bunny rabbits and things in a basket. It was so exciting. I mean, not like here in England. Germany then was lovely. And then the following morning, the teachers hid all the eggs and gifts in trees and bushes all around the grounds. But it wasn't till the afternoon that we were allowed out to race around, and we were hunting them out. All of a sudden, 6 or 8 children dressed in uniform, like scouts, suddenly appeared. They had sticks in their hands. As they marched past, they asked if we were Jews. And when we said yes, they started to beat some of us with those sticks, really savagely. There was lots of blood and screaming. It was terrible. It was a horrible sight to see children suffering like that. Well, then the teacher eventually came out and shooed the uniformed kids away. It was horrible to see, though. I thank God they didn't attack me.
In 1939, Anne was one of the lucky few Jewish children evacuated from Germany in the Kindertransport. Most never saw their parents again. In Britain too, children were being evacuated from the major cities and ports to the countryside.
In 1939, I was at Annerley Deaf School for boys. Our teacher told us one day that Britain had declared war with Germany. It came as a complete shock to us when we were evacuated to the countryside. Because at that time all the deaf schools were being evacuated from London for fear of the bombings. I was sent to a place in Surrey, which was really just a load of huts beside each other. I must have been there for 3 months, but received no education while I was there. We were getting frustrated at having no school until eventually they found us a place at Exeter Deaf School in Devon, where I stayed. I had a torch, a very dim torch which lit the path ahead. There were some streets which also had very dim street lamps too. But I managed. I knew the way home anyway. I knew the streets and the roads. I was used to it.
There were times when we had to wear a gas mask when we went out. The teacher would tell us to put them on, and we'd wear them for a while, until the all clear, when we could take them off. They were horrible, big, black, chunky things, awful. But at least they'd have saved your life if anything were to happen. Luckily, nothing did.
You just couldn't have the best of everything, because things were rationed. Like good food. I remember meat, for example. We had rarely. Fish was very rare. It wasn't easy. It was a hard life, really.
Rationing, yeah. The shops were a fiddle. If you wanted more of something, because one wasn't enough, you couldn't buy it because you'd reached your coupon limit. So they'd sell it to you at black market prices. Yeah, it was double the cost, but at least you got what you wanted. And so what if they made their profit? The black market was rife. My sister lived in Stoke Newington, in some tall flats that had a shelter in the middle that everyone went to for safety. Once, when I went to see my sister, I was shocked to see that the block of flats on the other side had been completely flattened. By a bomb, I think. The shelter had gone too. It had been completely destroyed. I was told that our friends and the hearing people who'd been in the shelter had been killed, that no one got out alive. I thought of my sister, but thankfully she'd stayed at home. She wouldn't go into that shelter. Thank God she was all right. I worked in Aldgate, and the hearing people I worked with said they could hear the sirens and we needed to take refuge. One of them said they could hear where the bomb had fallen, and it was near to where my two sisters worked. I was really worried about them. I often met them at lunchtime, but now I didn't know what was happening. So I sneaked off to try and look for them. I suddenly saw my two sisters coming towards me with cuts on their foreheads caused by glass. But we hugged. Thank God we were all safe. We talked for a bit, and then as they were about to head back and I was about to go back to my work, my boss saw me and said, "What are you doing out?" So I explained I was worried about my sisters, and he said, "You're sacked." I wasn't that bothered. I knew there were plenty of jobs, so I was happy just to get my coat and go home with my sisters. Next day I found another job.
One day, I saw a film by Pathé News, which showed bodies of Jews on the ground. And it made me remember my mother saying to me, "I'll see you in 2 weeks' time." And that never happened. It made me realize that that's what had happened to her, that my mother was gone. When I got married, I told my mother-in-law that somebody had told me that I could apply to find out what had happened to my family. So I got in touch with my solicitor, who said it would be difficult to help me because I was the only one in the family. My brother had been left behind in Germany. I was lucky. I had a really good solicitor helping me, and he asked me what I'd done in all the years since then. I told him how I'd suffered. We decided to find out what had happened to them. My mother had died in March 1945, just 3 months before the liberation. My father died in 1942 at the camp in Belsen of starvation. My mother had died in the gas chamber. My brother died with them. We don't really know how.
How did I feel after the war? Well, naturally, I was very happy it was over. I was fed up of the war. Going to the shelter, going to work, going home, not being able to go out or enjoy life, the blackouts. It was a hard life. When the war was over, it was a huge relief. I was happy. I remember going to Trafalgar Square where there were thousands of people glad that it was all over, celebrating victory. It was wonderful. I enjoyed it very much.
It was a huge relief. We could relax. Thank God there was no more worrying about the shelter. You could meet up with deaf people again. I heard of some people being killed and felt sympathetic. But we managed to put it behind us and get on with our lives with a smile.
Life was difficult when the war was on, but we got through all the air raids, the bombings and the blackouts. Then all of a sudden, it was over. For 6 years, our lives had been on hold, and then the war was over. It was hard trying to rebuild our lives again, but bit by bit, slowly but surely, we got there. It took some time, 3 or 4 months, before our lives were back to normal again. We were going back to work, back to the deaf club, playing sports, those sorts of things. But it did take time. When the rationing was over, I was so happy. Everything was back to normal again. We could have fish and chips, egg and bacon, everything, and plenty of it. I was so happy about that.
The Queen was young when she got engaged. She was 21. The Silversmith and Jewellers Association wanted to make a presentation to Princess Elizabeth. She wasn't the Queen yet. She was still the Princess at 21. They wanted to make a brooch for her. So they asked 50 different jewellery firms around the country, and we were one of them, to make a piece of jewellery worth £800. Don't forget, this was 1947. So we made this brooch, and I was the diamond setter. I put the diamonds and the rubies into the brooch. When it was finished, we gave it to the Silversmith and Jewellers Association, who then took all the brooches sent in and all 50 forms. They were placed onto a tray and taken to Buckingham Palace, where the Queen, Princess Elizabeth's mother, picked out the brooch that I made. I won the competition out of 50 other entries. My wife was a beautiful bride. Absolutely beautiful. Our photo was published in the newspaper. Deaf couple married in 1946.
1851 was the Festival of Britain. It was also the year we got married, which was the same day as King Farouk of Egypt. May the 6th. My husband was very proud.
I remember seeing Roger Bannister, who was the first to break the world record for the 1 mile run. Oh, it was wonderful. That was at Oxford. I remember watching it on my television, which had a tiny 9-inch screen. Oh, it was an exciting race. Wonderful. I was very proud of him.
The tape is broken, and so is the record athletes have long been dreaming about. But at first, Bannister knows little about it.
Roger Bannister, he was incredible because he had a huge impact on the world. Not just Britain. He broke the 4-minute mile record. People had been trying for years to crack it, and then finally he did. It was like a huge breakthrough. But now everyone is beating the 4-minute record. But Roger Bannister was not a professional athlete. He was an amateur. He didn't train every day. He probably only trained about 2 or 3 times a week. He was a marvelous athlete.
When I left Manchester, of course, I was pretty poor. I had no money. In fact, I only had 3 shillings in my purse and no savings. A lot of boys would approach me, but they soon lost interest when they found out I had no money and no home. I was staying in a hostel in Cricklewood in London. I was the only deaf person there, and I felt very isolated. Then one day, I went out for a walk in the neighbourhood, and I saw a couple signing. Their signing caught my eye, so I went over and asked if they were deaf. They said they were. Well, I told them that I was too, and that I was staying at the hostel. When they found out it wasn't a deaf hostel, and that I was there all alone, they said they'd come and take me to the deaf club to play badminton. And that's where I met the man who became my husband.
I remember the first time I saw television. It was the FA Cup final between Blackpool and Manchester United in 1948. A good friend of mine had bought a television, a 9-inch, so it was very, very small. And he asked me over to his to watch the football. There were 9 deaf people at his house, and we were all very excited. It was black and white, not colour.
It was really exciting. It was black and white, but it was worth seeing the whole ceremony, from the Queen setting off from Buckingham Palace, going on to Westminster, and then seeing her being crowned and anointed. The reading, and then seeing the Queen Mother and the Queen, and the child and Princess Margaret. It was lovely. Then when it was finished, there was the procession with her in the robe, and the poor thing having to wear that heavy crown. And then the carriage took her to Buckingham Palace. When she came out on the balcony, the crowds all pushed forward.
The Manchester United football team were involved in a plane crash in Munich, in Germany, on their way home from playing a brilliant football match. It was a terrible tragedy for the British people, because the team was very famous. They were known as Busby's Babes.
My father said that he'd buy me a car if I did well at Merry Hare, so the pressure was on. But I did do well, and he gave me a red Mini, an Austin Mini. I remember the registration number was 456XOO. And deaf people used to tease me about it, saying, "Zoo, zoo." But I loved that car. My father said, "I'm giving you this car on one condition, that you take us around London and you take us on holiday." I didn't have a problem with that. That's before I was aware of politics. I was too young. But I do remember we ate well and were comfortable at that time. I remember going shopping with my mother, who always had a long list, and she would make me speak. I'd have to ask for the things on the list. There weren't any supermarkets in those days. You had to queue at the counter. And I'd get more and more nervous as it got nearer and nearer to my turn. When I got to the counter, I'd ask for cheese and have to point to the one that we wanted. I asked for £1 and loved to watch them cut a chunk off with the cheese wire and then put it on the scales to weigh it and wrap it. Then I'd ask for half a pound of butter. From a big slab, they would cut and pat a block of butter, leaving a nice rippled top, and wrap that too. I used to love watching them. I really enjoyed it. Then I'd ask for £2 of sugar, which they would scoop out of a big barrel into a blue waxed packet, and then tie the top. I enjoyed all of this, but communication was a problem, having to point to everything we needed and ask for it. But those days are gone. We have supermarkets now.
Things are so different now to my day. For example, we used to go out at night and come home late in the morning without any fear. Nowadays, though, people who go out late are afraid of being mugged or raped or any number of things. Much different to what it was like in my day. People would go out without a care. You just didn't think of those things at that time.